There is an old saying that the loudest person in the room is often the least busy one. Think about that for a moment. We all know someone like this. Maybe it's someone from your neighborhood. Maybe it's someone you see every day at work. Or maybe, if you're being honest with yourself, maybe it's been you at some point. Someone who always has big plans. Someone who always talks about what they're going to do someday. Someone who announces dreams like they're already achievements. Before starting the story, if you are new to our channel, please subscribe. Also, be sure to tell us where you are listening to this story from. And don't forget to share your valuable opinion at the end of the story. This is a story about that person, and about what it took to change him. But more than that, this is a story about you. About the silent war that happens inside every person who has ever been poor, who has ever struggled to pay rent, who has ever looked at their empty wallet and still dared to dream of something better. This story is for every person in America who grew up watching their parents stretch $20 into a week's worth of meals, for every person who has worked double shifts and still felt like they were falling behind. Because the real enemy of a poor man's dream isn't the economy, it isn't bad luck, it isn't even the system. The real enemy lives inside your mouth in every word you speak before you've earned the right to speak it. Let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus grew up in a small town in rural Tennessee. Not the kind of small town you see in movies, with charming diners and friendly neighbors waving from porches. This was the other kind of small town, the kind where opportunity left years ago and nobody bothered to send a postcard. The kind where the dollar store was the nicest building on Main Street, and payday loan shops outnumbered churches. His father worked at a lumber yard his entire life, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, for 32 years. And what did 32 years of loyal, back-breaking work get him? Bad knee, a small trailer that still had a mortgage, and a pension that barely covered his medication. Marcus watched his father come home every evening, tired in a way that went deeper than the body, tired in the soul. And Marcus made himself a promise, a quiet, burning promise. He was not going to live that life. From the time he was 12 years old, Marcus loved woodworking. Something about taking a raw, rough piece of lumber and turning it into something beautiful, something useful, made him feel alive in a way that nothing else did. He would spend hours in the small shed behind their trailer, experimenting with scraps of wood his father brought home. A small shelf here, a crooked box there. But Marcus also had another habit, a habit that, for years, he mistook for ambition. He loved to talk about what he was going to do. By the time he was 19, Marcus had announced his dream to become a master carpenter to practically everyone in town. At the diner, at church, at family cookouts, at his cousin's birthday parties, Marcus always found a way to work it into the conversation. "I'm going to open my own custom furniture shop," he'd say, leaning back in his chair with a confidence that had no foundation beneath it. "I'm going to build high-end stuff. People in Nashville, in Memphis, they're going to pay big money for handcrafted furniture." You watch, and people did respond. They smiled, they nodded, they said things like, "That sounds amazing, Marcus, and you've always been talented and I believe in you, boy." And in those moments, in the warmth of that praise, something happened inside Marcus that he didn't understand yet. Something quiet and dangerous. He felt satisfied. Not the satisfaction of having done something, the satisfaction of having said something. The praise felt like a reward, and his brain, his very human, very fallible brain, registered that reward and quietly whispered, "You've already made progress, you can rest now." So he would rest. Days would pass, then weeks. His tools would sit untouched in the shed. And then something would spark his excitement again. Maybe he'd see a beautiful piece of furniture online, or hear about someone making good money in a trade, and Marcus would be right back at the diner, announcing his plans to whoever would listen. The cycle repeated itself for years. By 25, Marcus was working at a hardware store making just over minimum wage. He was behind on his car payments. He had $1,100 in credit card debt, not from luxury spending, but from groceries and gas and the quiet desperation of trying to close the gap between what he earned and what life cost. He had a notebook full of sketches of furniture he wanted to build someday, and he had years of people's encouragement stored up like trophies he hadn't actually won. He was rich in praise and poor in everything else. His mother never said much. She was a quiet woman who had learned that certain kinds of love show themselves through action, not words. But one evening, sitting at their small kitchen table, she looked at Marcus and said something simple, something that he wouldn't fully understand for months. She said, "Baby, a rooster crowing don't make the sun rise." He laughed it off at the time, but those words planted something in him. The real turning point came on a cold Thursday evening in November. Marcus was helping a customer at the hardware store, an older man, maybe late 60s, with sawdust on his boots and the quiet, steady hands of someone who had worked with them for decades. The man was buying sandpaper, high-grit sandpaper, the kind you use for the final, careful finishing stages of a woodworking project. Marcus, doing what Marcus always did, started talking. He mentioned that he was a carpenter himself, that he was planning to start his own business, that he had big things coming. The old man looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he looked down at the sandpaper in his hand, then back at Marcus, and he said, very quietly, "What have you built lately?" Marcus opened his mouth, and then closed it, because there was nothing to say. That question hit him somewhere deep in the place where the truth lives before we dress it up in excuses. The old man wasn't being cruel. He wasn't trying to embarrass Marcus. He asked the question the way a good doctor asks where it hurts directly, because that's the only way to find what's wrong. Marcus handed the man his change and watched him walk out of the store. And standing there behind that counter, surrounded by tools he sold but rarely used, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Shame. Real, honest, clarifying shame. Not the kind that destroys you, the kind that wakes you up. That night, Marcus drove home in silence. He sat in his car in the driveway for a long time, and he thought about all the years, all the conversations, all the praise, all the nothing. And for the first time in his life, Marcus stopped talking even to himself. There is something they don't tell you about silence. Most people are afraid of it. We live in a world designed to fill every quiet moment. Notifications, background noise, other people's opinions flooding our feeds every hour of the day. We have been trained to perform our lives instead of live them, to announce our intentions instead of execute them, to measure our progress by how many people are watching instead of how much work we are actually doing. But silence, real silence, is where transformation begins. Marcus discovered this the hard way. The morning after he sat in that driveway, something in him had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment. There was no sudden burst of energy, no inspirational song playing in the background. He woke up at 6 in the morning, made himself a cup of black coffee, and walked out to the shed behind his mother's trailer. He stood in the doorway and looked at the space, dusty tools hanging on pegboards, a workbench with a thin layer of grime on it, scraps of wood piled in the corner like forgotten intentions. He didn't announce anything. He didn't text anyone. He didn't post anything online. He just picked up a piece of wood, grabbed a hand plane, and started working. That was it. That was the whole revolution. One quiet morning, one piece of wood, and a decision to stop waiting for applause before the performance had even begun. Now, here's something important, something that nobody in Marcus's town ever talked about, because nobody in his town had ever been taught to think about money this way. Marcus was broke, not temporarily inconvenienced broke. Structurally, generationally broke. The kind of broke where you do the math in your head at the grocery store before you put things in the cart. The kind of broke where you know exactly how many days until payday and exactly how many bills are waiting. So when Marcus decided to get serious about woodworking, he couldn't just go buy expensive equipment. He couldn't enroll in a fancy trade school. He didn't have a mentor with a fully stocked workshop ready to teach him for free. What he had was a hardware store job and a 40% employee discount. And so Marcus did what people with limited resources have always done when they are truly serious about something. He got creative, and he got disciplined. Every week, Marcus took his paycheck, and before he paid anything else, before he bought anything extra, he set aside $20. Just $20. That was his woodworking fund. Some weeks it felt almost laughable. $20 doesn't buy much when you're talking about tools and lumber. But Marcus had read something once, a simple idea that stuck with him. Water doesn't cut through rock because it's powerful. It cuts through rock because it's consistent. $20 a week, every week, no exceptions. He started buying tools slowly. A quality chisel set 1 month, a better handsaw the next. He learned to haunt estate sales and thrift stores on weekends, where he found old tools, real, solid, American-made tools from decades past for almost nothing. A hand plane that would have cost him $80 new, he found for $4 at an estate sale in a box marked miscellaneous. He cleaned it, tuned it, sharpened the blade, and it worked beautifully. For lumber, he made a deal with a local construction company. He asked if he could take their scrap wood, the offcuts and leftovers that were destined for the dumpster. They said yes without hesitation. One man's waste became Marcus's raw material. This is something that wealthy people rarely understand about people who grew up poor. When you have nothing, you develop a kind of resourcefulness that money can actually kill. You learn to see value where others see garbage. You learn to solve problems with ingenuity instead of a credit card. And that skill, that quiet, unglamorous skill, is one of the most powerful tools a person can carry through life. Marcus worked in the shed every morning before his shift at the hardware store. He woke up at 5:30, was in the shed by 6, and worked until 8. Then he showered, drove to work, came home in the evening, ate dinner with his mother, and studied. He watched every free woodworking tutorial he could find online. He read library books about joinery and wood finishing. He took notes in a small spiral notebook that he kept in his back pocket. He talked to almost no one about what he was doing. This was the hardest part, not the early mornings, not the sore hands, not even the frustration of making mistakes and having to start over. The hardest part was the silence, because Marcus had spent years getting a certain kind of emotional attrition from other people's reactions. He had been feeding himself on compliments and encouragement the way some people feed themselves on fast food. It felt satisfying in the moment, but it wasn't actually building anything. Now he had to learn to feed himself differently. He had to find satisfaction in the work itself, not in what people said about it. And in the beginning that was genuinely painful. There were mornings when he stood in that shed and felt completely alone. When he looked at a joint he couldn't get right and felt the old voice in his head whisper that maybe this was foolish, that maybe he should just accept his life, that maybe people like him, people from places like this, with backgrounds like his, with bank accounts like his, maybe they just weren't meant for more. That voice is not unique to Marcus. That voice lives in the head of every person who has ever tried to climb out of poverty with nothing but their own 2 hands and a refusal to quit. It is the voice of every discouragement you ever absorbed without realizing it. Every time someone looked at your circumstances and quietly decided you had a ceiling. Every time the math didn't add up and life seemed designed to keep you exactly where you were. But Marcus had learned something from his father, even if his father had never said it directly. He had learned it from watching a man go to work every single day, without complaint, without drama, without any guarantee that it would ever get better. There is a kind of dignity in that, a quiet, unshakable dignity that has nothing to do with success and everything to do with character. Marcus kept going. 6 weeks into his new routine, something unexpected happened. He was working on a small step stool, simple design, nothing complicated, and he cut a dovetail joint almost perfectly. Not perfect, almost, but close enough that when he held the 2 pieces of wood together and they fit with that satisfying tightness that good joinery produces, he felt something move through his chest. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter than pride, something more like recognition. Like a part of himself that had been asleep for a long time was slowly waking up. He didn't call anyone. He didn't take a picture. He just stood there in the sawdust in the early morning light, holding those 2 pieces of wood together, and he let himself feel it. That feeling, small, private, earned, was worth more than every compliment he had ever received. Around this same time, Marcus started paying closer attention to his finances. Not in a panicked, reactive way, but with the same quiet discipline he was bringing to his woodworking. He wrote down every dollar he spent for 30 days. Every single dollar. Coffee, gas, the vending machine at work, everything. What he found surprised him, even though it probably shouldn't have. He was spending $60 a month on things he genuinely did not need and would not have missed. Small things, impulse things, the kind of spending that happens in the 2-second gap between wanting something and thinking about whether you actually need it. He redirected that $60, 20 to his tool fund, 20 into a savings account he opened at a local credit union, his first real savings account, and 20 toward his credit card debt, on top of the minimum payment. It wasn't a lot. By the standards of personal finance books written for people who already have disposable income, it was almost nothing. But for Marcus, it was everything. Because it was the beginning of control. And control, the feeling that you are steering your own life rather than just surviving it, is something that poverty systematically tries to take from you. He was taking it back, quietly, methodically, without telling a single person. And somewhere in that silence something was growing. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with doing the right thing when nobody is watching. It doesn't get talked about enough. We celebrate the results, we share the transformation photos, the success stories, the before and after. But nobody really talks about the middle. That long, quiet, unglamorous stretch of time between the decision to change and the moment when change actually becomes visible. That period when you are doing everything right and the world around you looks exactly the same as it always did. That middle part is where most people quit, not because they're weak, not because they didn't want it badly enough, but because human beings are wired to need feedback. We need to know that what we're doing is working, and when the feedback doesn't come, when the results are still invisible and the sacrifice is very real, doubt moves in like an unwanted roommate and makes itself at home. Marcus lived in that middle place for a long time. 4 months into his silent routine, very little had changed on the surface. He was still at the hardware store, still driving the same car with the check engine light that had been on for 2 years, still living in his mother's trailer, sleeping in the same bedroom he had slept in since childhood, with the same water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like the state of Florida. But underneath the surface, things were shifting in ways that don't show up immediately, the way a seed underground has already begun to split open and push upward long before you see anything above the soil. His hands had changed. That was the first visible sign. They had become the hands of someone who actually worked with them, steadier, more confident, carrying the small scars and calluses that are the honest biography of a craftsman. When he picked up a tool now, it felt like an extension of himself rather than a foreign object. His mind had changed too. He had developed something he hadn't had before, the ability to think in problems and solutions rather than in dreams and obstacles. When a joint didn't work, he didn't get discouraged and walk away anymore. He asked himself why it didn't work. He studied it. He tried a different approach. He failed again, studied again, tried again. This cycle, which sounds tedious when you describe it, had become almost meditative for him. It was teaching him a way of thinking that would serve him far beyond woodworking, and his relationship with money had quietly, steadily changed. By the end of his 4th month, Marcus had paid off his credit card completely. Every last dollar. He had done it with discipline so simple it almost seemed too basic to work. He had stopped spending money on things that didn't move him forward, and he had thrown every extra dollar at the debt until it was gone. No complicated strategy, no financial genius required. Just the radical countercultural act of spending less than he earned and directing the difference with intention. The night he made that final payment, he sat at the kitchen table with his mother and didn't say anything for a while. She was doing a crossword puzzle, the way she did every evening. He just sat there, feeling the particular lightness that comes when a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it was there is finally lifted. His mother looked up at him over her reading glasses. "You look different," she said. "I paid off my card," he told her. She nodded slowly, the way she always did when she understood something was bigger than the words used to describe it. She reached across the table and patted his hand once. Then she went back to her crossword. That was enough. Now, around this time, something happened that tested everything Marcus had been building. And I want you to pay close attention to this part, because this moment, this specific kind of moment, comes for everyone who is trying to change their life. It comes dressed in different clothes each time, but it always shows up. And how you respond to it determines everything. Marcus's cousin Darnell came back to town. Darnell was 2 years older than Marcus and had moved to Atlanta 5 years earlier. He had done well for himself, not wealthy, but stable. He had a good job in logistics, a decent apartment, a car that didn't have any warning lights on the dashboard. And Darnell was the kind of person who wore his relative success lightly. He wasn't arrogant about it, but his presence had a way of making the gap between where he was and where Marcus was feel very visible. They had dinner together at Marcus's mother's house, and Darnell started talking about opportunities in Atlanta. A friend of his was looking for people to join a multi-level marketing business, supplements, health products, the usual structure. Darnell wasn't pushing it hard, but he mentioned that a few people he knew had made real money with it, quick money. The kind of acceleration that felt appealing to someone who had been grinding slowly for months with very little to show for it on the surface. Marcus felt the pull. He would be lying if he said he didn't, because that is the cruelest trick that slow, honest progress plays on you. It makes fast, dishonest shortcuts look unbearably attractive. When you have been waking up at 5:30 every morning for 4 months and you're still driving the same broken-down car, someone offering you a faster road feels like mercy. Marcus thought about it for 2 days. He ran the numbers in his head. He looked at his savings, small but real, earned dollar by honest dollar. He thought about the tools in his shed, about the dovetail joint he had finally mastered, about the step stool and the small shelf he had built, and the satisfaction he felt in that work that no commission check had ever given him. And then he thought about his father, about 32 years of loyal work, about a bad knee and a small trailer, and he realized there was a difference, an important difference between his father's situation and his own. His father had worked hard for someone else's dream. Marcus was working hard for his own. That distinction mattered more than the pace. He told Darnell he appreciated it, but he was going to pass. Darnell shrugged, said he understood, and they talked about other things for the rest of the evening. No drama, no confrontation. But inside Marcus, something had quietly solidified. A kind of commitment that goes deeper than motivation. The kind that doesn't depend on how you feel on a given morning. He went back to the shed. Now here is where the financial discipline Marcus had been building started to compound, and I use that word deliberately because compounding is the most powerful and most underappreciated force available to people with limited resources. With his credit card debt gone, Marcus redirected that payment money. He increased his savings contribution. He also did something that a co-worker had mentioned once in passing. He opened a Roth IRA at the same credit union where he had his savings account. The contribution was small, $40 a month. By the standards of investment advice given to people who already have wealth, it was almost too small to mention. But Marcus had come to understand something fundamental about small numbers and time. A dollar saved at 25 is not the same as a dollar saved at 45. The early dollar has years, decades to grow, and every month that he contributed, even that small amount, he was doing something his father had never had the chance to do. He was building something that worked while he slept. He also started selling things. His first piece, a small wall shelf with clean lines and a simple finish, he listed on a local Facebook marketplace for $45. He wasn't sure anyone would buy it. He almost took the listing down twice because he was afraid of the vulnerability of it, of putting something he made with his hands out into the world and waiting to see if anyone thought it was worth anything. It sold in 3 hours. A woman named Patricia bought it for her daughter's bedroom. She sent Marcus a message afterward that said simply, "It's beautiful. My daughter loves it. Do you make other things?" Marcus stared at that message for a long time. He wrote back and said yes. Over the next 6 weeks, he sold 4 more pieces, nothing elaborate, a small coffee table, 2 more shelves, a wooden serving tray with handles. His total earnings from woodworking in those 6 weeks came to $230. By most measures, that is not a life-changing amount of money, but that is not the right way to measure it, because that $230 represented something that a paycheck never had. It represented proof that the thing he was building in the silence and the sawdust and the early mornings was real, that it had value, that people would pay for it with their own hard-earned money. And proof, when you have been living on hope and discipline alone for months, is everything. Marcus did not tell anyone at work. He did not post about it on social media. He did not go to the diner and announce that he was now a furniture maker with paying customers. He just quietly deposited the money, noted it in his small spiral notebook, and went back to the shed. The seed was underground still, but the roots were spreading. reaching deeper than anyone could see. And Marcus was beginning to understand something that would change the entire trajectory of his life, that the greatest power available to a person with nothing is not money, and it is not talent, and it is not even opportunity. It is the willingness to work without an audience, to build in the dark, to grow in the silence, to trust the process even when the process offers you no applause, no validation, no proof that it's working except the slow, quiet, undeniable evidence accumulating in your own hands. That is a power that cannot be bought. It cannot be borrowed. It cannot be faked. It can only be earned, one morning at a time. There is a moment that comes if you stay the course long enough, when the work starts speaking for itself. You don't announce it. You don't plan for it. You don't even fully recognize it when it first begins to happen. It arrives quietly, the way dawn arrives, not all at once, but gradually, until suddenly you look up and realize the darkness is gone and the whole world is lit up around you. That moment came for Marcus on an ordinary Saturday morning, 11 months after he had stood behind that hardware store counter and been asked the question that changed everything. What have you built lately? He was at a local farmer's market, not to sell, just to walk around, to get some air. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and sawdust still on his boots because he had been in the shed since 5:30 that morning working on a commission piece. His first real commission, a custom dining table for a family in the next town over who had found him through Patricia, the woman who had bought that first wall shelf for her daughter's bedroom. Word had traveled the way good work always travels, not through advertising, not through announcements, but through the quiet, powerful current of one satisfied person telling another. At the farmer's market, a woman stopped him. She had seen his work online. Not from anything Marcus had posted, he barely used social media at this point, but from a photo Patricia had shared on a neighborhood community group. The woman wanted a custom bookshelf for her home office. She had a specific vision, specific dimensions, a specific wood tone she was looking for. She pulled out her phone and showed him a screenshot of what she had in mind. Marcus looked at it, thought about it for about 15 seconds, and then told her he could build it. She asked him his price. Marcus gave her a number, a real number, not apologetic, not padded with unnecessary hesitation, but a fair and honest number that reflected his time, his materials, and the quality of what he produced. She said yes without negotiating. Marcus drove home that morning with the windows down, even though it was cold. He needed the air. He needed to feel something real against his face because what was happening inside his chest felt almost too large to contain in a normal quiet car ride. He was not rich. Let's be clear about that. He was not anywhere close to rich. He was still at the hardware store, still in his mother's trailer, still driving that car with the check engine light. The gap between where he was and where he wanted to be was still wide and real and required honest work to cross. But he was no longer standing still. And there is a difference, a profound, life-altering difference between being poor and standing still, and being poor and moving forward. One is a condition, the other is a direction. And direction, sustained over time, becomes destiny. Over the next several months, Marcus built his small operation with the same quiet discipline that had gotten him this far. He raised his prices twice, not arbitrarily, but because his skill had genuinely improved and the market consistently confirmed that his work was worth more than he had initially charged. He kept his expenses low with a kind of intentionality that had become second nature to him by now. Every dollar that came in from woodworking went through a simple system he had developed in that small spiral notebook, a third back into materials and tools, a third into savings and his retirement account, and a third toward eventually getting out of debt on his car. Simple, unglamorous, devastatingly effective. He also started studying the business side of things with the same hunger he had brought to the craft itself. Not because he had natural business instincts, he didn't. And he would tell you that openly, but because he understood that talent without structure is just a hobby, and he was no longer interested in hobbies. He watched free small business content online. He visited the local small business development center, which offered free consulting to people starting businesses, a resource he had not known existed and which cost him absolutely nothing to access. He learned about setting up a proper business structure, about tracking income and expenses, about the basics of self-employment taxes. He made mistakes. He underpriced a large project and lost time he couldn't get back. He bought a piece of equipment on impulse that he didn't actually need yet and had to tighten his budget for 6 weeks as a result. He took on a client whose vision kept changing and learned, the hard way, the value of a clear written agreement before work begins. Every mistake cost him something, and every mistake taught him something worth more than what it cost. This is the part of the story that most motivational content skips over, and I think that omission is dishonest and ultimately harmful. The path from struggle to stability is not a straight line. It is not a clean upward curve. It is jagged and inconsistent and full of moments where the progress you've made feels fragile and the ground beneath you feels uncertain. There are weeks where everything clicks and weeks where nothing does. There are days when you feel like you are finally becoming the person you always believed you could be, and days when the old voice comes back and asks who you think you are. The difference, the only difference between people who make it through and people who don't, is not intelligence or talent or luck, although all of those things play a role. The difference is whether you keep showing up on the days when showing up feels pointless. Marcus kept showing up. 14 months after that night in the driveway, Marcus left the hardware store, not dramatically, not with a speech or a scene. He gave 2 weeks' notice, thanked his manager sincerely because the job had given him the discount that gave him his tools, and gratitude costs nothing, and walked out on his last day carrying a small box of personal items and a feeling he could not quite name. Relief was part of it. So was fear. So was something that sat underneath both of those things like a deep, steady current, a feeling that this, right here, was what choosing your own life actually feels like. He had enough consistent woodworking income to cover his basic expenses. Not comfortably, there were still tight months, still calculations, still the discipline of watching every dollar with attention and intention. But he was out. He was working for himself, and he had built that reality entirely in the silence, with his hands, without asking anyone for permission or validation. His mother came out to the shed the evening of his last day at the store. She stood in the doorway the same way Marcus had stood there 14 months earlier, looking around at the space, taking it in. But the shed looked completely different now, organized. Clean tools hung properly on their pegboards, a half-finished dining chair on the workbench, the smell of fresh sawdust and wood oil and work. She didn't say much. She looked around for a long time, and then she looked at her son. "Your daddy would have loved to see this," she said. Marcus nodded. He didn't trust his voice right at that moment. She turned and went back inside, and Marcus stood there alone in the shed, and he let himself feel the full weight of that moment. The grief in it and the hope in it and the complicated, tender love that runs through the story of every person who is trying to do better than the generation before them, not because that generation failed, but because they sacrificed so that the next one could go further. That is what this is really about. Not woodworking, not savings accounts, not any specific strategy or technique or formula. It is about the decision, the quiet, daily, unremarkable-looking decision to stop performing your potential and start building it. To take whatever small thing you have, $20 a week, an hour before sunrise, a piece of scrap wood and a second-hand tool, and treat it with the seriousness and respect that most people reserve only for things that are already large and already impressive. Because here is the truth that Marcus learned, and that I want to leave with you today. Your dream does not need an audience to survive. It needs your hands. It needs your consistency. It needs the willingness to work in the dark, in the silence, in the unglamorous middle of the process. Without applause, without validation, without anyone watching, the seed does not need to be admired to grow. It needs to be planted. It needs darkness and pressure and time. And if you give it those things, if you protect it from the frost of other people's opinions before it's strong enough to withstand them, it will grow into something that nobody can take from you. Look around at the people you admire most, not the ones who talk the biggest game, but the ones whose work genuinely moves you. I promise you that behind every one of them, there is a version of this story. A shed, an early morning, a decision made in silence, a long stretch of time when nothing was visible from the outside but everything was happening underneath. That is where real things are built. So here's what I want to ask you to do, not someday, not when the conditions are right, now. Whatever goal you have been announcing to the world, put it away. Stop talking about it, not forever, just for the next 30 days. Give yourself 30 days of pure, quiet, unwitnessed effort. No posts, no updates, no checking to see how many people are impressed with your journey. Just the work. Just the daily, honest, unglamorous work. Wake up early if you have to. Put aside whatever small amount you can, even if it feels laughably small. $20, 10, 5. The amount matters less than the habit, and the habit matters less than the identity that the habit slowly builds inside you. The identity of someone who does not wait for permission, someone who does not need an audience to begin, someone who understands that the most powerful thing a struggling person can do is not complain about their circumstances and not escape from them in fantasy, but build, brick by quiet brick, day by honest day, a different reality. Write it down in a small notebook, keep it private, let it be yours alone for 30 days and watch what happens to the quality of your effort. When the only person you are accountable to is yourself, and when those 30 days are done, when you look at what you have actually done rather than what you have merely said, you will understand something that no one can teach you with words alone. You will understand what Marcus understood, standing in that shed on that cold November evening with sawdust on his boots and his mother's words still warm in his chest, that the loudest thing in the room is rarely the most powerful, that the most powerful thing is usually the quietest, that real progress doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives one day, steady and undeniable, built from 1,000 mornings nobody saw, and speaks in a voice that requires no introduction. Let your work be that voice, let your results be that announcement. And trust with everything you have that if you plant the seed in silence and tend it with discipline, the tree will come. And when it does, the whole world will see it without you having to say a single word. Now give me summary of this story. 9:35 p.m. Here's a concise summary of the full story. Marcus grew up in a poor rural Tennessee town, the son of a hard-working lumberyard worker who spent 32 years of his life laboring for very little in return. From a young age, Marcus dreamed of becoming a master carpenter and opening his own custom furniture business. But for years, his biggest problem wasn't lack of talent or opportunity, it was his mouth. He constantly announced his dreams to everyone around him, collecting praise and encouragement like trophies, and every time people applauded his plans, his brain registered it as a reward and quietly killed his motivation to actually do the work. He was rich in other people's compliments and poor in everything else. The turning point came when an old customer at the hardware store where Marcus worked asked him one simple, devastating question: "What have you built lately?" And Marcus had nothing to say. That silence woke something up in him. From that night forward, Marcus made a radical decision. He stopped talking and started working. Every morning at 5:30 he went to his shed, picked up his tools, and built quietly, privately, without telling anyone. He collected scrap wood from construction sites, hunted second-hand tools at estate sales, and used his employee discount strategically. He saved $20 every week without exception, paid off his credit card debt with laser focus, opened a savings account and eventually a small retirement account, and tracked every dollar he spent. He turned down a get-rich-quick opportunity from his cousin because he had learned to trust slow, honest progress over fast, empty shortcuts. Month by month, his skills improved. He sold his first piece for $45, then more pieces followed through word of mouth. He took on commissions. He raised his prices as his quality improved. He made mistakes, learned from every one of them, and kept showing up, especially on the days when showing up felt pointless. 14 months after that night in the driveway, Marcus left his hardware store job and became a full-time craftsman running his own small business. He had built it entirely in the silence, with his hands, without asking anyone's permission or validation. The central lesson of the story is this: your dream does not need an audience to survive. It needs your consistency, your discipline, and your willingness to work without applause. Stop announcing your goals and start protecting them. Plant them like seeds in silence and darkness. Tend them with daily honest effort, and trust that when they are ready, the results will speak louder than any words ever could.